When you replace the rod bolts, you have to resize the rods, right? Right? Finally back in the shop again. It's been a while. I noticed I picked up some new subscribers along the way, so I wanted to say welcome aboard. And for the OG subscribers, thanks for sticking with me. Still have a long list of things to get done on the Mustang, so it's still taking up, well, it's dominating the shop right now. It's taking up all the space. Still waiting for parts from Liberty on the transmission, so no progress on getting that fixed yet either. Now, if you watch the earlier videos and you've got a really great memory, you'll know there's a 100% stock bottom end engine in the Mustang now, in the street engine. And that includes a completely stock oil pan, which has no baffles and no windage tray. Now, I haven't had any oil pressure issues yet, but I'm a big believer in proper oil control, and that means having a good windage tray. So that's on the list of things to install. Started thinking that, well, if I have to pull the pan to install the windage tray, while I'm in there, I might want to put in some stronger rod bolts, since I'm now regularly spinning the engine to more RPM than the factory intended, and I have no history on the engine for mileage or any kind of abuse. But anyway, that's the plan. We're going to pop in some new ARP rod bolts while the pan is off and while we're in there putting in our windage tray. Wait. Have you forgotten everything you know as an engineer, Ed? Higher strength rod bolts will increase the clamping force on the rod. Increased force means increased displacement. More stress equals more strain. In other words, more distortion. The big end of the rods must be resized with the new bolts so they'll be properly round again. Don't make me use this. Don't listen to that nerd. Resizing the rods means you'll have to pull the whole engine out and apart. That'll be a ton of work and cost, more money than you have time to spend. Trust me, just put the rod bolts in. It'll be fine. Billy Bob says so. Do it properly. This is what my life is like every day as an engineer. It's a constant struggle between doing things properly and doing a good enough, quick and cheap solution. So in this case, how can we decide which way to go? I think it was Ben Strader who said, you either have data or you have an opinion. Well, I like that saying. How can we get data? Well, we measure. Ford specifies allowable tolerances for the connecting rod dimensions. But first off, well, what's a tolerance? We can never manufacture something or measure something to an exact dimension. For example, if something's supposed to be 2 inches, then is 2.000001 acceptable? Or is that unacceptable now? So we need a range of what we consider acceptable measurements, and that's what we call the tolerance. Ford specifies for the 5-meter connecting rods, you'd have an acceptable big end diameter of 2.239 to 2.2398 with an out of round tolerance of 0.4 of a thou. Now, while it's a completely stock bottom end in the engine now, I did pull it all apart to install new rings and bearings, and in the process I measured everything, including the rods that are in there right now. None were perfectly round, but they all fell within the Ford allowable tolerance limits, including a couple that were right on the acceptable ragged edge of the limit. So here's the experiment to separate the fact from opinion. Let's take a rod with stock rod bolts, torque them to stock spec, and measure the big end. Then we'll install the improved ARP rod bolts, torque them up to spec again, or well, to stretch actually in ARP's case, and then we'll measure everything again. Let's see exactly how much the dimensions of the big end change with the new rod bolts, and whether those changes are still within tolerance. Fortunately, I have a bunch of other 5-liter parts lying around, so I have lots of other stock rods. So this is a completely stock rod out of a stock engine with stock rod bolts in it. It's never been resized, never been rebuilt, and it doesn't look like it's ever been abused. And now that I'm looking at these things, I can't get over how short and cute these rods are. But anyway, let's measure this thing with our dial bore gauge set up so that it's going to read 0 at our minimum acceptable diameter of the 2.2390. To do that, we're going to use a 2 to 3 inch micrometer. To calibrate the micrometer, we're going to use standards. I can't remember who said it, but the difference between this being a precise measuring instrument or just a C-clamp is the standard. So let's start with that first. Let's get this thing set up and calibrated to our standards, and then we'll set up our dial bore gauge, and then we'll start measuring. We'll measure the thing in this dimension, we'll measure the thing in this dimension, and then we'll see if we're out around. Okay, we're going to start with our micrometer. This is a micrometer for measuring from 2 to 3 inches. So we're going to check it against a 2-inch standard first to make sure that it's properly within calibration, because we are measuring to the 1/10 of a 1,000th of an inch, and we need to use precise measuring instruments and make sure that they are bang on. Okay, so that's good at 2 inches. Now we'll check it at the other end of the scale at 3 inches as well. We'll dial this guy out to 3 inches. And let's see where we are. And look at that. All right, so we know that we've got a good calibrated micrometer, so now we're going to set this to the minimum of the Ford tolerance. So if we start at our minimum setting, which is 2 inches for this micrometer, we can dial it out to, whoops, too far, 2.2 inches. We want 2.239, so we need another 39. So that's 20, that's 25, that's 30, that's 35, 6, 7, 8, and 9 right there. Now we'll take our dial bore gauge, and using the micrometer, we'll set this thing for our 0, which is almost exactly right. I just need a tiny little tweak in that direction. Try this again. And I turned the dial the wrong way. So we need to go this way. About a 1/10. And I overshot it by about a 1/2. Okay, so we'll go back this way about a 1/2. And this time we should be bang on. And we are. Now, on our dial bore gauge, every number that you see here is 1/1000th of an inch. So every little division in there is a 1/10 of a 1,000th. Okay, so we're going to take our connecting rod, we're going to torque it up with the stock rod bolts, and then we're going to measure it with this thing, put the new rod bolts in, measure it again, and see what the difference is going to be. All right, we got our connecting rod in our rod vise. We've put some oil on the threads and the nuts because that's what Ford recommends. And the torque that Ford specifies for this, for the 5-liter HO, is 19 to 24 foot-pounds. So we've got our torque wrench, and we're going to set it to, let's go to 23. And lock it in there.
snug them up first, and then torque them. Okay, and you might also notice that my torque wrench has been calibrated too. So, all right, let's go and measure this guy. Then we'll put the new rod bolts in and torque that up, and then measure it again. All right, we've got our connecting rod still clamped in our rod vise, but now we've moved it to the pin location so that we can get in here and measure our big end with our dial bore gauge. So I've marked the connecting rod in two different locations here. So we'll measure it there, and then we'll turn and we'll measure this position as well. So starting in our first position, if you can see that, that's about 2.2393. Okay, so we'll write that down. 2.2393. Okay, so that's well within specification, well within tolerance, actually, if you want to get more precise. And in our second position, we're at, well, we're just 1/10 of a thou bigger in that position. So 2.2394. Or was that 4 or was it 5? Now I've forgotten. Let me go back and check it. No, it was 5. Okay, so we're 2/10 of a thou bigger in that position. But again, we're still within tolerance, and we're still within our out of round allowance as well. All right, let's get our new rod bolts in and see how they measure up. All right, we've got our new rod bolts in, and with the ARP, we're going to use ultra torque on there instead of oil to get the torque up. The other thing with the ARP bolts is it's not just about torquing them, it's about measuring the stretch on them. So we've got a stretch gauge, and using our 2-inch standard, we've zeroed it out to, if I can get this on the camera, we've zeroed it out to our 2-inch standard, and we got to pay attention that when we're on the 0 on the big dial, we're on the 2 on the small dial. So the ARP bolts have little dimples on the ends that are just made for stuff like this. So this bolt, for example, here, 2 inches was again with the small dial on the 2. So that's 2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.272. Okay, is what we're going to call that length. So we're going to measure both of these bolts before we start stretching them, so we know what the length is in the unloaded condition. As I fumble around with this, and make sure that we're in the dimples on both ends. There's a lot of fumbling. Okay, so on this bolt, we're at 2.273. We'll write that one down, 2.273. And on this side, we're at 2.27 exactly. 2.270. Now, the instructions that came with the rod bolts say that we want to shoot for a stretch of 6.7 thou to 7.1 thou, and if we can't measure the stretch, then that's, at about 28 foot-pounds of torque. Now, the odd thing is, for this exact same part number, when I download the instructions from the ARP website, they're asking for 6 to 6.5 thou at 35 foot-pounds. So which one's right? I don't know. This is why we measure. So we're going to start torquing this up, and we're going to see how quickly these ones stretch. If they stretch a lot, then we're going to go with this spec. If they're stubborn and they don't stretch much, then we'll see if we get to 35 foot-pounds and if we get to 6 or 6.5 thou of stretch. Okay, but let's get this thing properly into the rod vise now, and then we can start torquing and checking the stretch on it. All right, so we snuck up on it slowly. We're at 35 foot-pounds now, and that's exactly the 6.5 thou. So it looks like the new instructions that are on the website are the ones to go by. So 35 foot-pounds gave us the 6.5 thou of stretch that we wanted. Okay, so now let's measure the big end again and see what's going to happen with the new rod bolts. All right, we've got our new ARP rod bolts in. We've got them torqued up to spec. Well, we've got them actually stretched to spec, but we know that they're where they're supposed to be. And we've gone back and we've rechecked the calibration on our dial bore gauge to make sure that nothing's changed with it kicking around on the bench while we were working on other stuff. So now let's go back. We'll remeasure. We'll start with position 1 here again. And again, we've zeroed the dial bore gauge to a dimension of, what was it, 2.2390. Okay, and position 1 with the stock bolts was 2.2393. We're actually under that. That's 2.2390, and we're 0.5 of a thou under that now. So we've shrunk that dimension by 0.8 of a thou. Okay, so that's pretty big. Okay, so we're at 2.238. What did I say? 5. Right? Double check that again. And, well, we're saying 0.6 on this measurement now. But anyway, so we've shrunk between 7 and 8. Well, it just depends on where, if we're measuring in the middle of the rod or towards the outside of the rod. But we've shrunk that first dimension by between 7 and 0.8 of a thou. So think about that with your bearing clearance. If you were to lose 7 to 0.8 of a thou in bearing clearance, you probably wouldn't be happy with that. Now, in position 2, make sure I'm properly aligned here, we were at 2.2395, and that dimension's gotten bigger. So the big end of the rod has definitely gone out of round, and it's way out of the out of round spec for Ford now. So that's showing about 0.8 there, so 2.2398. That dimension got bigger. So 2.2398. All right, so with our connecting rod, again, we measured in 2 different positions here. We measured in position 1, which is straight across this way, and then in position 2, which was across in that other direction. With the stock rod bolts, this was our dimension for position number 1. We went from 9.3 thousandths here down to 8.5 thousandths, so it shrunk in this dimension by 7 to 0.8 of a thou. In the position 2 dimension, we went from 9.5 thousandths to 9.8, so that grew by 0.3 of a thou. So with the stock rod bolts, we were within the out of round specification that Ford allowed us, 0.4 of a thou. We were within that, but now with the ARP bolts in there, we are definitely out of round. Okay, so we got shorter in this dimension, we got bigger in that dimension, and if you think about this, you just lost 7 to 0.8 of a thou of a bearing clearance by putting these rod bolts in here, not to mention that things aren't round in the big end anymore. So, what's the conclusion? Did the measurements change? Yeah, they did, by more than I expected, quite a bit. So, the egghead engineer was right. I told you. So, there you have it. Do you absolutely need to resize your rods when replacing rod bolts with, well, higher performance rod bolts? Yeah, I'd say so. Listen to the egghead engineers. They might know what they're talking about. Thanks for watching. As usual, like, share, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you on the next video. Hopefully not another 3 months from now.